Hello, and welcome to Ipse Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Blake Reed, Associate Clinical Professor of Law and Director of the Samuelson Glushko Technology Law and Policy Clinic at the University of Colorado Law School. We will discuss his article, Internet Accessibility. So welcome to the podcast, Blake.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, the pleasure's all mine. And I thought your paper was a really interesting and sort of thoughtful intervention into how we ought to think kind of structurally about sort of applying the ADA and concepts of accessibility in an internet context. But I was wondering if you could start a little more generally for people who may not be so familiar with the ADA and how it goes about promoting accessibility. So what is the ADA and where did it come from?
Sure. So the ADA has its roots actually back in the kind of the tail end of the Reagan years. It was enacted in 1990, but sort of started, or the movement toward it started in the Reagan administration. And the big idea was for, it actually started with veterans coming home and having combat injuries of various sorts, and basically running into all sorts of discrimination in society, or basically an inability to sort of integrate. And the Reagan administration and then the George H.W. Bush administration started to dig into that. And so it was this interesting, and obviously disability issues and discrimination against people with disabilities has been around for long before that. So there was sort of this coming together of Republican and Democratic policymakers over how to make sure that people with disabilities, particularly including veterans with disabilities, have access to society. And so there was three main approaches that the ADA took, or maybe four, depending on how you want to count it. And the first one is discrimination in places of employment. And so Title I of the ADA says you can't discriminate against employees with disabilities. And then Title II of the ADA is all about state and local government. So the big idea was if you're running a government program or service, you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. And then the big one that most people are familiar with, and if you've read about this in the newspaper, you've probably read about Title III of the ADA, and it says places of public accommodation have got to be accessible. And the big idea there is, when you're going around in the built world, you're going in and out of stores, you're going in and out of restaurants and bars and that sort of thing. Those places have got to be accessible. And so when people think about things like wheelchair ramps and, accessible bathroom stalls and that sort of thing, that's sort of the big part of the ADA was saying, the built world that people go into has to be built in an accessible way. And if it's not built that way under certain circumstances, it's got to be retrofitted to be accessible to people with disabilities. So that's sort of where it starts.
Okay, so I think implicit in that is the recognition that the ADA was conceptualized and passed before sort of the internet and virtual spaces were really a thing. How was the ADA conceptualized when it was created, and how does that conceptualization translate to kind of a non-physical virtual world?
Well, it's an interesting question because it's one of these laws that would, is sort of a foundational approach to how we think about society that was passed right before the commercial internet took off, right? So, 1990, the internet was just beginning to take off, and it was kind of a gleam in Tim Berners-Lee's eyes. And so the ADA was drafted without the internet in mind. So there's a couple of different views, right? So you look at the language of the ADA, and it talks specifically about places of public accommodation, and that's some language that has its roots back in the Civil Rights Act. And a lot of people look at that and say, well, it's talking about the built physical world. It's talking about building. It's talking about places that people go to and visit as places of public accommodation. And I think there's a countervailing school of thought, which is, no, the Title III of the ADA is all about making society acceptable or accessible, however that might look, and that the ADA actually had technology in mind. And there's some bits of the legislative history of the ADA that sort of say, we anticipate new technology is going to evolve and change how society works, although I don't think they had the transformations that the internet would bring specifically in mind. And that Title III is really intended to be this really broad tool to take whatever we sort of think of as society and make that accessible. And so those are the competing views. And in the 1990s, as the internet starts to come into being, that's where you start seeing people debate and say, well, the internet is starting to become this integral part of society. Is this a place in the ADA's parlance? Is this something that we need to make accessible? Or is this something sort of different that was beyond the scope of what the ADA was intended to cover?
In your paper, you spend a lot of time talking about the concept of place as sort of a metaphor and how that metaphor is used or has been used to think about translating sort of traditional or the original concepts of the ADA as applying to physical spaces to applying in virtual spaces or over in an internet context. In what ways do you think that place metaphor has been helpful, and are there ways in which it's been unhelpful in terms of promoting accessibility?
Yeah, so in a doctrinal sense, the word place features really prominently in Title III of the ADA. So I think from the early days of the commercial internet, disability advocates, who, by the way, and maybe we should spend a second talking about the accessibility problems that arise online. And they can range anywhere from videos being shown without closed captions to websites being architected in a way that they're incompatible with screen readers that blind people use to read the text of a website aloud and navigate around it using a keyboard. That metaphor of place is embedded right in the text of Title III, right? So place of public accommodation. And so right from the jump, as disability advocates are trying to apply the ADA to the internet, this question of, well, how do we conceptualize the internet as a place becomes front and center. And so that draws a lot of attention to, well, is the internet a place? Let's think about how we can conceive of the internet as a place. And so we think you start to see a lot of language around, well, the internet is cyberspace, right? It's a cyber place, and people are going out and visiting websites, right? And you sort of get this idea of there being a virtual world. And then, through the early parts of the 2000s, we start to see things that make this metaphor even more literal, right? We have like Second Life, it's a virtual world that you literally have an avatar that you go walk around in virtual reality and all of that sort of stuff. And so we start to really zero in on this idea that we need to argue that the internet is a place that people inhabit and people go around. And that ends up playing out in litigation. Because disability advocates sort of say, well, what's the place where we can, or what's the area of the internet that we can most easily conceptualize as a place? And the easiest thing on the internet to conceptualize as a place is a website, right? And that's how we talk about websites. We go visit websites. They're sort of the buildings or the businesses of the internet. And so that metaphor kind of carries into litigation, and that's basically overtaken how the ADA has been sort of litigated in the internet over the last 20 years. There's all these lawsuits about websites, right? So does Title III of the ADA apply to websites? And then we've got this big circuit split that I can talk a little bit more about.
Sure. And maybe you could do that in the context of this really interesting distinction that you make in your paper, and I think deploy really cleverly in sort of thinking about kind of regulation and accessibility on a kind of more macro level when it comes to the internet, which is this distinction between internal and external perspectives that you draw from Oren Kerr among other people. I was wondering if you'd explain what that distinction is and how it helps, use the place metaphor in a different or perhaps kind of more holistic way.
Yeah, so right around the same time, these web accessibility lawsuits are starting to heat up. Internet law scholars are having this much broader conversation about the placeness of the internet, and it turns out that this, how we treat the internet in this place metaphor has consequences not just under disability law, but under all sorts of different laws. And we see this divide erupting between different camps of internet scholars about different perspectives that you can take on the internet. And so you mentioned Oren Kerr, who sort of famously articulates this dichotomy, and he says, well, there's one way to look at the internet, and that's through an internal perspective, and that's sort of virtual reality. Let's put ourselves in the perspective of the user. What is their experience of the internet? They experience it as cyberspace, going into this place, and they sort of experience it as this integrated whole, if you will. Then on the other hand, you have this other perspective called the external perspective, which sort of says, no, the internet is not a metaphysical place. When we get on the internet, we are sitting down in a chair in an office with a keyboard in front of us. We're typing out commands, and those are going into a computer with a microprocessor, and that computer is hooked up to a network cable, and it translates what our commands into ones and zeros and zips them across this network, and they're received at the other end. And so really the internet is just this pile of computers and wires and keyboards and and bits. And that's really the way that you ought to conceptualize what the internet is. And one of my favorite examples that Oren uses to illustrate this is he talks about this case involving a bomb threat. So a guy is, and I'm going to get the details a little bit wrong, but the guy has a girlfriend in high school, and he wants his girlfriend to be able to get out of class so they can go hang out. And so he sends a text to some mutual friend of theirs with a bomb threat in it, and he uses AOL Instant Messenger. And the feds come in and charge him with transmitting an interstate bomb threat. And the guy says, well, wait a second, I just texted my friend 3 miles away or right across town. That didn't cross state lines. And so from his perspective, that's not an interstate communication. He's just going right across town. And the feds say, no, you're using AOL Instant Messenger, and its servers are located in some other state. And so for the message to get to your friend, you send it to AOL servers, and they send along to your friend, and that ended up crossing state lines, right? So that's kind of so the guy is taking the internal perspective, the feds are taking the external perspective, and it turns out which perspective you take really matters in terms of the analysis, right? Either that's an interstate bomb threat or it isn't. So it's sort of dispositive. And so internet law scholars got into this enormous debate about which of these perspectives is the right perspective to take on the internet.
That's fascinating. And it actually helps me understand kind of better what's going on in your paper, because I feel like you're actually using that distinction in a very different, and in some ways, I think more productive kind of way. I mean, it struck me that like that internal perspective is critical to understanding in a disability context when there's an accessibility problem. In other words, you can't know whether or not somebody's having trouble accessing what they ought to be able to access on the internet without taking an internal perspective of, their experience of trying to use the system. But then it seems like in order, from a regulatory standpoint, or from a perspective of fixing the problem, it seems that you're suggesting in the paper that it's really critical to look at it from an external perspective as well, because only by thinking about the different layers or relationships between, different parts of the internet and how they work together, can we practically think about actually having efficient solutions to some of these problems.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the way this debate has played out in the web accessibility context is we've got a circuit split where some courts take an internal perspective and say, a place of public accommodation under Title III, well, that can be a website because a user experiences that as a place. Or, the ADA is really all about making society accessible, and websites are sort of an important and salient part of that. And so the fact that there's not a physical location doesn't really matter, right? And so you see courts in the First Circuit, especially, and the Second and the Seventh to some extent, taking that perspective. And then you see courts in other circuits taking this external perspective and saying, well, no, when we're talking about places, we're talking about some place in the world, right? We're talking about a building. And we are either going to not apply that to websites at all because they're just, sitting on a computer somewhere, or in the approach the Ninth and the 11th Circuits takes, we're going to require that there be some connection, some nexus between a website and a physical building, right? So the classic case, or the one that just came out, is the Domino's Pizza case, right? Where Domino's Pizza's website is covered, but only because there is a physical Domino's location that if you go order your pizza, it's going to print out a little ticket in Domino's, and they're going to make a pizza that's going to come out of the oven, and then they're going to deliver it to your house, right? So as a doctrinal matter, this internal and external perspective has been sort of the battle that plays out. But what I try to do in the paper is get beyond that and say, well, there's actually this generation of disability law scholars that are saying an internal perspective is really important, normatively speaking, because it recognizes that that accessibility is all about how the person with a disability experiences the internet, right? And we really need to have this normative, understanding of that experience, so that when we think about, how to make society accessible, we do it with how the person experiences it in mind. And so there's a lot of scholarship that sort of is dedicated to developing that view. And the contribution I try and make in this paper is I come along in the spirit of, like Brett Frischman has made this argument, Julie Cohen and others, and say, well, we can supplement that internal perspective and understand that it's normatively important to understand that with an external perspective that says, the internet really is this complicated mix of stuff, right? It is a bunch of servers and computers and networks and, bits that, and if we want to serve the goals of the person with a disability to be able to access the applications and the content and the devices that make up the network, we need to think about it in a more granular and broad way, right? We need to understand that when you're sitting down accessing a website, you're accessing content that might have been uploaded by a user to a platform, and that platform is serving up the website, using standards that have been developed by international standard setting bodies. It's being rendered in a browser that's developed by someone else. It's being shown on a device, or a tablet or a laptop that's been developed by yet someone other than that, and it's being delivered over a network that's also being being operated by someone else. And there can be accessibility problems that actually crop up at each of those parts of the internet. And so in order to serve this normative goal of making the experience for the user with a disability accessible and work for them, we need to have a little bit of an external understanding of how the internet works.
So maybe you could talk about that in relation to a particular problem to make it a little more concrete, because in the paper you talk about kind of this kind of almost like frame-based thinking of how the internet works, like sort of differing levels of sort of I don't know, say generality or something along those lines. It's like the experience is mediated by a set of norms or kind of technical norms or specifications, which is mediated by the sort of physical technology that's being used and so on and so forth. How do those problems play out in particular contexts?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to give an example of that. So I was looking last week. I don't know if you heard about the news story about Fluffy the cat, who's got frozen in a snowbank for 7 hours in Montana, and then got miraculously brought back to life by these vets. So, Fluffy has 8 lives, and so there are all sorts of news stories proliferating about Fluffy and all sorts of video going around. So I hopped on. I was just looking for a video of Fluffy, and one of the first ones that popped up was on Yahoo News, and I noticed, so there's this video kind of telling the story of Fluffy that pops up in Yahoo's video feed, and I noticed it doesn't have the captions. It doesn't have a little button that says closed captions or CC, if you've probably seen on web players. And so if you're someone who's deaf or hard of hearing and you run into that, basically this video is going to be inaccessible to you. You're not going to be able to understand what the person is saying who's narrating the story. And so that's a pretty classic internet accessibility problem. So if you take an internal perspective on that, as a user, you went to Yahoo and the video wasn't accessible, and the analysis kind of stops there, right? And a lot of folks say, well, that's Yahoo's fault, right? It must be a problem with Yahoo, and we need to have some sort of legal remedy against Yahoo to fix it. But if you take an external perspective and you sort of think about, well, what's actually going on here? You go a little bit deeper. So Yahoo actually, I looked into this video. It turns out that Yahoo is actually embedding and sort of streaming this video from Facebook. This video is originally posted on Facebook. So it could be that Facebook, in implementing its video player, didn't add the closed caption button, didn't include the architecture in its video system to be able to support it. Could be that ABC, this is a national ABC story, I think it was on Good Morning America or something like that. So ABC actually uploaded the video. And the problem could be that ABC forgot to add captions to it or didn't add captions to it. Or perhaps they added captions on television when the show aired in the first place. But when they clipped the video to put it on their Facebook page, they somehow didn't get the captions to go along for the ride, right? So the captions could have gotten lost there. Then the video is playing in, I was looking at it in Google Chrome, and it turns out that the video player has got to interact with Google Chrome in order to render the caption controls the right way. And you actually might get a different result if you open the video in, say, Safari or Firefox, right? So the video player might have some example or some role in it. And the video or the browser in turn has got to interact with the operating system on your laptop or your tablet, right? So it could be a problem with Apple's application programming interface. And then you're watching this video over an internet connection, right? So I was watching it on Xfinity at my house. And it turns out that lots of ISPs have what are called content delivery network systems that substitute different resolution versions of videos to sort of conserve bandwidth. And maybe it's the case that Comcast substituted the video in a way that corrupted the caption file, right? And so if you take an internal perspective, you look at it and you say, well, this is just Yahoo's fault that this Fluffy the cat video didn't show the captions. But if you take this external perspective, you identify something like 6 or 7 different places where the problem could have occurred, and maybe it's more than one place. And that has legal consequences, right? Because if you go to Yahoo and you say, hey, you need to make this video accessible, their first response is going to say, well, we don't have anything to do with this video. We're just sort of, framing it on our site and pulling it in from somewhere else. And how do you get to the other actors? You kind of don't have the tools to figure that out. But if you take this external perspective and understand there's all these other actors involved in the delivery of this video, it turns out there's actually a whole bunch of rules that the FCC and other agencies apply in this context that might actually be being broken here. And so some kind of informal complaint or dispute resolution at the FCC might actually be the way to fix this. And so that's kind of an example that I tease out to sort of show, sometimes the solution to these problems is not filing a Title III lawsuit, but it's getting on the phone with a consumer protection specialist or an enforcement specialist at the FCC and basically trying to get to the bottom of what's going on. It's almost kind of legal tech support, if that makes any sense.
Mm. Yeah, I was struck by the way in which you sort of seem to suggest that thinking more kind of abstractly about like standard setting and how the sort of the internet toolkits that people use to kind of fashion the quote unquote buildings, as it were, websites and so on, are as important or, equally important, maybe even more important in some ways than focusing on the kind of the websites themselves in terms of fixing problems. And so far as, you can kind of structurally have a much bigger impact if you think about kind of minimizing accessibility issues or maximizing accessibility likelihood at that kind of macro level.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you think about just websites as an example, and you think how many websites are out there, and it's in the order of billions, or probably tens or hundreds of billions. I'm not sure. But the idea of going and filing a lawsuit in federal court against the proprietor of every single website on the internet to make it accessible to every person with every type of disability, it's kind of like the same problem that the content industry was facing in the mid-2000s when they were trying to cut down on file sharing by, and filing copyright lawsuits against individual infringers. When it's happening at such a broad scale, when the problem is so broad, trying to sort of fix it one thing at a time is a difficult approach. But one of the things I talk about in the paper is I say, well, look, what are the common, elements of these billions of websites? Well, a significant proportion of the websites on the internet are built on platforms like WordPress and Squarespace and that sort of thing. And there's actually not been any, Title III litigation against any of those platforms. But it turns out those platforms potentially have some problems with how they do accessibility, right? And they also present authoring tools to people making their own websites that can, do either a good job or not such a good job nudging people towards making their content accessible, right? And so I started to think about, well, who are the intermediaries? Who are the platforms on the internet that, have a lot of control over what sort of content gets generated? And it turns out little nudges on those platforms, even if they're, they don't seem like a big deal, can be a really, really huge contributor to accessibility. So I was thinking about if you use Instagram, you've seen recently that they've added a feature that allows you to add a text description of your picture, which I think for most people is sort of like, why is Instagram asking us to do this? And the answer is, well, it's all about making Instagram accessible to blind and visually impaired people. And if you can nudge the people that are uploading millions and millions of pictures to Instagram to take a few seconds every time they upload a picture and try to make it accessible, then that's going to have a way bigger impact than than you could ever have if you tried to, I don't know, go sue every user on Instagram under Title III. And so that's kind of the goal of the paper, is to get disability advocates and disability scholars thinking about where can we position these interventions so that they're going to have maximal effect and they're going to lead people to make the content and the applications that they put on the internet accessible.
So, Blake, I know that this paper grew out of some of your policy-oriented work, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that work and sort of how it affected or influenced the ideas you're discussing in this paper.
Yeah, so I'm actually a clinician, and I run a tech law and policy clinic. And when I got started as a teaching fellow back in Georgetown, at one of the clinics at Georgetown back in the early part of the 2010s, the first project that landed on my desk was this rulemaking at the Federal Communications Commission about making internet delivered video accessible through the provision of closed captions. And when I started this work, I never sort of thought about these issues and never encountered them. But through the clinic, I got to know and work closely with a coalition of deaf and hard of hearing consumer groups on these issues. And they basically were all about implementing there's a digital update to the ADA that a lot of people are not familiar with, called the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act that President Obama signed into law in 2010. And so I spent the first 5 or 6 years of my clinical career basically working through the implementation of the CVAA, which is basically the FCC has to, run all these advisory committees and do all these rulemakings and basically create these really detailed technical rules for how we do things like show closed captions and playback audio description and make the user interfaces of video players accessible. One of my favorite ones is we worked on the requirements to make the remote controls for cable set-top boxes accessible. So we worked on a lot of things like that. And one of the things I noticed in doing that work is there are a lot of disability advocates that were sort of skeptical and didn't really understand or buy into what was happening at the FCC because it wasn't work that is happening under the ADA. And then I think likewise, working at the FCC and working in telecommunications law, I had occasion to interact with a lot of internet law scholars that are like, wait, what is this disability thing? Isn't that the web lawsuits that are happening under the ADA? What are you talking about all this FCC stuff? And so part of this paper was born out of a desire to say, hey, there's actually this really rich and complicated kind of gooey center between internet law and disability law that's bigger than the ADA's application to websites that would make it worthwhile for disability lawyers and disability scholars to engage with what internet lawyers and internet scholars are doing, and vice versa for internet law scholars and internet lawyers to take really seriously what's happening with digital accessibility. And so this paper is kind of an effort to crystallize those years of work and say there's actually a really important kind of unexplored body of law at the intersection of these two areas. And so I tried to sort of sketch that out in addition to all the stuff about perspectives and all of that.
Yeah. So Blake, I know that there's a lot of discussion of this happening right now at the FCC, and it's a conversation that you're personally involved in. I was wondering if you could just spend a couple minutes in wrapping it up, talking about kind of where you think or hope that conversation is going to go in the near future.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because we're in this strange political time under President Trump, and this is not a time in which the FCC has been particularly aggressive in adopting regulatory actions, generally speaking. And so a lot of the work that we're trying to do right now is preserve the gains that we built up for consumers with disabilities during President Obama's tenure, and particularly during the tenure of Tom Wheeler, who is the FCC chairman under President Obama, and really is ought to be hailed as a hero for disability rights. I mean, the amount of work that and resources and political capital that Tom expended on these various initiatives at the FCC is pretty amazing. But it's a different time under President Trump, and I think one of the things we're just sort of waiting to see what happens in the next 2 years and what will happen with the next round of elections. And in the meantime, I think we're also trying to engage with some of the bigger conversations that are happening around internet law, right? So think a lot about privacy. So think about the intersection of privacy and disability. How do we implement some of these accessibility features that require personalization for people with disabilities? How do we implement those in a privacy protective way? We're engaged in conversations around copyright law, right? It looks like a lot of third parties will need to intervene with accessibility efforts of various sorts. So how do we calibrate exceptions and limitations in copyright law to facilitate that? Some really cool stuff happening with machine learning and artificial intelligence, where we're doing things like automated closed captions and automated video description or audio description. And how do we calibrate copyright law to allow those sorts of things? And then, there's this big conversation happening about how do we divvy up responsibility with the really big platforms, the Googles and Facebooks and YouTubes and so forth of the world, between those platforms and their users? How do we, how are we going to hold those platforms accountable for what happens on them? And so we're trying to think about how does accessibility become part of those conversations, because as I said, it's going to take a lot of action on the part of platforms to make stuff accessible online. So those are some of the things we're thinking about, but it's an interesting and complicated political time. So I'd love to hear your predictions, because the next 2 years will be a wild ride, I'm sure.
Great. Well, I can only wish you the best of luck in this important enterprise. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, Blake.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
He's keeping America moving, keeping America strong, providing the wheels to the future, helping our world move along. He's America's automobile man, marching at the head of the band. He's leading the way to a brighter today, and he's doing all that he can.
Helping you travel through this changing world, helping you get on your way. He's driving the highways of history, believing in today.
He's America's automobile man, marching at the head of the band. He's leading the way to a brighter today, and he's doing